Hello and welcome to revision tips for CIPS Level 4 Diploma in Procurement and Supply, Module 3 Commercial Contracting and Learning Outcome 2, which is to understand the fundamentals of specifications and key performance indicators that are included in commercial contracts with suppliers. So first we're going to look at the content of specs and then we'll appraise the examples of different KPIs that you can use in contractual agreements. So a specification should be produced for all contracts and orders because without one, the supplier's not really going to know what it is that you want. And you'll have nothing to protect you in the event of a dispute. The court would always want to see what the purchaser required the supplier to deliver. The length and detail of the spec will vary depending on the value and complexity of the goods or services that you're buying. And that may have a significant impact on the type of suppliers who are capable of delivering the contract and the leverage that's available to you as the buyer. So for example, if the purchaser specifies a specific brand, they have very limited leverage. But the spec really is this description of requirements that helps to communicate between the suppliers and the stakeholders. And it provides us with a means of measurement so that we can evaluate performance against that spec. That's going to help us to minimise risk, and it details exactly what we need. And it's a key requirement in every contract. I often say a specification is the heart of the contract. And there are three broad approaches to writing a specification. The first one on the left is the input-based, and within an input-based specification, the buyer effectively prescribes to the supplier precisely how the contract must be delivered. There's literally no scope for the supplier to innovate. And provided that the supplier delivers what's been asked for, there should be no problems. If a problem does arise, it's likely to be the buyer's fault, as they've told the supplier how to do it. So this, for example, could be a chemical formula that's needed. The middle one, the output-based, is where the buyer defines the performance required and the supplier works out how best to achieve it. So an example of this would be commissioning an advertising agency, where the overall outcome is not known. And the far on the right one is the outcome-based specification, which is quite often used in the public sector, especially when you're talking about social care or welfare contracts. The supplier defines the overall outcome they're seeking, but how it's achieved is entirely down to the supplier, such as delivering rehabilitation for offenders. The main problem with this approach is evaluating and comparing proposals from different bidders. Now here are some specific terms and specifications that are used in different industries. So you sometimes hear of a blueprint or a design, which is quite common in engineering or construction. A brand name, which might be used for retail, consumers and small businesses. A sample might be something you would specify if you were looking at textiles or commodities. A market grade, if you were looking at commodity trades like diamonds and precious stones. Standards, you would look at that for manufacturing and engineering again. A performance or a functional spec is quite often used in manufacturing. Chemicals and physical properties you'd see in, again, chemical engineering, construction. Outcome-based specs are for services or projects, and output is on things like IT consultancy. Now, a performance specification is sometimes referred to as a functional specification. It specifies what's needed to be achieved rather than focus on how to do it. So an example is if an IT system was being produced, the developer would need to know which other parts of the organisation's ITs it needs to connect with, how many users it might need to access, the server platform on which it will be based, the level of skills of the user, and how often it's needed to be updated, and a whole plethora of other areas that would need to be taken into account when pricing up the development time. But performance specs look at the functionality, performance, capabilities and outputs or outcomes which need to be achieved with specific tolerance levels. The key operating process inputs which will contribute to performance, the operating environment and conditions in which performance is to be achieved, and how the product is required to interface with other elements, any quality levels or health and safety requirements, as well as environmental performance levels and controls, and then the criteria and methods to be used to measure whether the desired function has been achieved. So here are some of the benefits and some of the most appropriate times to use a performance specification. So using a performance spec does have a number of advantages. It's much cheaper and easier to draft. You get far more supplier involvement. They can offer their expertise or alternatives. And you get the wider potential supply base and access to innovation. They're most appropriate when technology is changing rapidly, clear and objective criteria can be developed, or where the supplier has more technical know-how than you. And that means the buyer can have time to manage more complex evaluations. Now, the contents of any particular specification is going to depend and vary by the organisation and the product or service requirement. But here you can see a useful guide to the types of things you may want to consider to contain in a specification, such as the identification. That could be the title, reference number, issue number. In terms of the circulation, who is entitled to receive the distribution of that, and who might have commented on the variations, what its contents are, like the parts, annexes, the foreword, what was the reason for it? So, you could say that we're buying some paper, but the content and the foreword will help to say it's for this particular purpose, like making books or photocopying or whatever it might be. So that will help with the business need and the technical aspects. Then you'll put the scope, so the range of objectives and contents, and the definitions which have specific meanings in the text. There'll be the main body, which has got all the requirements, guidance, and methods. The annexes, like, I don't know, additional technical information or examples or drawings. An index, which might explain the definitions. And a big bibliography, which happens when you're referring to other authors and stuff like that, or other external standards or publications. But here we can see the aspects to take into account when ensuring that the specifications are effective. So they need to be clear and unambiguous, concise and but comprehensive at the same time. You need to make sure they're compliant with any relevant standards for health and safety or the environment or any laws of your country. It's important that you keep it up to date and expressed in terms which can be understood by all key stakeholders, that's both your buyers and your suppliers. And then it just says it should be value analysed, just to make sure that you're getting the right quality materials. Now here we show you some technical requirements which may be needed in the creation of a specification. So what's its intended function? What conditions should the product or service be required to operate under? The measures of quality and performance and the tolerances. So you might have different lengths or strengths or other properties where it's okay to be plus or minus 0.25% or something. And then any features like the colour, the smell, the texture or anything like that. Now, a specification can be created by the buyer or the supplier, but normally it is the buyer because they've got the specific requirements that need to be met. But it's often a group exercise rather than produced by one individual. So there may be several parties, the users, the buyers, the suppliers. It may be a templated format or be a committee-driven or an informal process. And our role as the buyer is to understand the needs of our user, liaise with them, minimise any tolerances, and understand the legal implications. Suppliers may also be involved because they help to draw upon what might be possible and also the implications, but this is known as early supplier involvement. And it's more important when you're doing something new or something different for the first time. Now, users such as designers and engineers generally take the lead in developing specifications, but procurement will lead if they have the relevant technical expertise. More complex specs will require input from departments such as design, engineering to help with the technical specs, or even marketing to ensure it's got the customer focus. Procurement may have autonomy for simple purchases. So I suppose the contribution we make is we're aware of what the supply market can do and the contracts that our business has. We'll also be aware of the commercial aspects of things that the supplier might be asking us to agree to, as well as the legal aspects to that. We make sure that we're following the disciplines and best practice, incorporating ethical, corporate social responsibility, and employment standards. Now, quoting standards and codes of practice can be used as shortcuts when writing specifications. So, a standard, as defined by the International Standards Organization, or ISO, is a document that provides requirements and specifications and guidance or characteristics that can use consistently to ensure that the materials, products, processes, or services are fit for purpose. A code of practice is a recommended means of acting in order to achieve a given aim, and there may be approaches that are equally acceptable. So they can be written by your organisation, a trade body, a national or international standards organisation. So standards in the specification will cite a number of different dates of publications to ensure that everyone's referenced in the same way. And they may be updated from time to time, and this can cause confusion if it occurs in the middle of a contract. Two options for referring to standards in contracts is to fix the date of the publication or the standard of that date of contract, or state the publication date as the standard to apply at the commencement of the contract, but include some wording that requires compliance to any subsequent additions. So what's the advantages and disadvantages of using standards? Well, the benefits clearly are that the spec can be shorter, suppliers understand it quicker, it removes the barriers to trade when you're using international standards, allowing people to have different approaches that will meet the outcome, and ensuring that you keep up to date. But the risks are that procurement might not be familiar with those standards. Staff may not fully understand the implications of what they're quoting, or be given insufficient thought as to what needs to happen when the standards are updated. And sometimes our small and medium enterprises are not always familiar with international standards that the larger companies can do. So the difference between standardisation and differentiation is standardisation is the process of making products or processes conform to a standard. This has got lots of benefits such as clarity of spec, you get economies of scale, it's far more reliable, enhancing the service, time saved in our processes, as well as getting accuracy in the quotes because there's less likely they're going to make errors. A wider supply market that can provide the standard products, a narrow supply base. You may actually save on inventory because you're only holding a small range of products, and a reduced risk. But then we've got differentiation, which is increasing the range of products available, quite different. And again, there's many benefits to this, such as you get more innovation, you could get economic factors such as producing cheaper versions of a product, helping to address cultural differences in the different product ranges means that you'll satisfy more customers. It will also increase your competition in a saturated market and provide the flexibility to increase your range. But don't forget to include your social and environmental criteria in your specifications. And the inclusion of these criteria can be driven by a number of factors. The ethical considerations can drive the inclusion of criteria such as compliance with international labour standards. The consumers are the driving force behind the criteria, and they specify production, for example, might need to be organic or fair trade, and that certain ingredients or minerals can be traced or sourced. Pressure from shareholders and stakeholders, governments, regulators, and the economic incentives such as cashable savings and process efficiencies, as well as talent management and the reduction in waste, energy and water. The social and environmental criteria should tie into your organisation's overarching strategy in relation to the social environmental objectives. It needs to be defined alongside individual specs, should be written into the contract in the same way as any other requirement using international standards where possible, and ensuring that they don't conflict with other aspects of the specification. You need to clearly indicate whether the requirements is a minimum standard, a mandatory level, or an aspiration to target. And have a cost associated with this. It might be larger for some suppliers than others, depending on the current practice. Now, KPIs are included in contractual agreements to indicate levels of performance that are required for the contract. Now, over time, measuring performance against the KPI tells you how well that individual contract is performing. Performance can be affected by the structure of the contract itself. Contract-specific KPIs can be included to measure the buying organisation too. So, for example, the number of payments made with terms and the timeliness, accuracy and completeness of orders. Contract KPIs can be used to assess the quality performance, the timeliness, cost management, resources and delivery of the contract. But when using KPIs, do remember, part of the purpose of having KPIs is to drive improvements in performance. So your targets should be set against which any improvements can be compared. And all your targets need to be SMART, that's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound. But do also consider the value of an improvement to a particular KPI and what value that will deliver to the business. What is the cost to deliver the improvements and who's going to bear the cost? And to consider whether there are likely to be any unintended consequences. So if the supplier diverts resources to one aspect, will it cause a detriment to another? Now the process for defining KPIs is firstly decide what matters. Now it's really important that you measure what matters most. Then decide how you're going to measure it. What data do you need? Does that already exist? And what type of measure is most appropriate? Is it pass-fail? Is it above a certain line? Who's going to measure it? And who will collect the data? And ideally that should be whoever's got easiest access. How often should you do it? Daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually? And how does the measure convert to a score? So what does good look like? Consider what's required by the specification and what levels of tolerance is allowed. And will there be any penalties? And conversely, if there's excellence, would you reward as a bonus? Now you need to ensure the specifications and KPIs align. So if the specification states that all deliveries are to be made within 28 days, but the KPI target for deliveries within 28 days is 95%, it could create a contractual conflict. But where tolerances are allowed, the spec should refer to the KPI target. Now, a major danger when considering measurements is having too many of them. The tendency is to measure everything that can be measured, rather than actually what matters most. So do remember the key principles behind key performance indicators, that they're the things that matter most to ensure that they can measure that performance has been delivered. So the acronym IPA is a useful reminder of what to take into account. So the I is important, the P is for potential, and the A is authority. So important, monitor what matters most. So responding to KPI information, cost, time, and money, so you can focus on what's important. Think about potential improvements or problems. If the measurement is confirming an existing position has no change, the cost of monitoring it will probably be wasted. And then authority or ability, the result needs to be capable of being acted upon, otherwise it's just information. Now here you can see an example of different categories that are used that may accompany a KPI. So for delivery compliance, an example of a KPI for lead time could be the current lead times compare favourably with previous lead times. This is not a measure as a percentage improvement of the previous period, but do note that shorter lead times may not reduce the overall duration of a project, and the buyer could end up with an additional inventory cost if the orders are delivered before they're required. For products and services, an example of a KPI is usably the product or service needs to be user-friendly. This can be measured by user satisfaction surveys. The issues include the cost of the surveys, whether the sample is representative, and whether the response is good or poor. For administration, an example of a KPI for a credit note could be suppliers issue no more than the stated number of credits per month. This could be measured by a count of the credit notes. Although it's aimed at ensuring the accuracy of invoices, it can reduce the credit notes being delayed. But for best practice and continuous improvement, an example of a KPI for supplier innovation could be that the supplier is proactive in suggesting innovation and workable solutions. It measures by the number of innovations that are implemented. But this can result in resources being diverted to seeking innovation rather than delivering the core contract. Now, all KPIs are dependent upon the availability of relevant data. What do you need to collect? Does it already exist in the buyer or supplier's systems? You must ensure that KPIs are based on the IPA rule and not on the availability of data. If the KPI is important, then it's worth collecting the data for it. But the three main types of data used in KPIs are binary measures, numerical measures, and qualitative or subjective assessments, which is usually converted into a numerical measure anyway. So very poor is often a 1 and excellent is a 5, for example. Now, using that KPI data for performance management should highlight, encourage, and reward excellent performance as well as controlling poor performance. And then you may have contractual remedies for encouraging KPIs, but they can only work if performance levels can be determined with a reasonable degree of certainty. Each party should have the right to audit the information used by the other party to determine the KPI outputs. Now, KPIs, as I said, can be quantitative or qualitative. The quantitative ones have a number associated with them, but the qualitative is really about how people feel about something. The types of numbers which we can use for quantitative measures, are things that are harder to measure, but the qualitative stuff like customer services and professionalism, they're the ones that are harder to measure. And these are termed qualitative. It is possible, though, through developing some kind of measure like positive customer comments or complaints, that we can delve deeper into the sources of dissatisfaction. Now, SLAs need to be specific for each service or product provided. They should also contain sufficient quantifiable measures for both parties to know whether the terms of supply are being met, and whether the relationship is progressing as expected. So it should include the standard or level expected, the expectations of the supplier, allocation of responsibility for activities, risks and costs, and how the SLA will be monitored and reviewed, and how complaints and disputes will be managed. Here you can see some of the benefits of producing SLAs, and one of the main benefits is that it forces both parties to identify what's most important, so that can be focused upon. So you can see here a clear identification of what's to be provided in relation to the specific services. Focuses attention on what services actually involve and what they should achieve. Identification of the real service requirements from the customer and potential for costs to be reduced by cutting things that basically don't add value. Having better customer awareness of what services they receive and what they're entitled to expect. Better customer awareness of what a service or level of service costs, realistic cost-benefit evaluation, and support for the ongoing monitoring and periodic reviews. Support for problem solving and improvement planning, and fostering better understanding and trust between providers and customers. Now this slide shows you the process that would be involved in producing a service level agreement. You may want to press pause so that you can read this information because it's quite small. But ideally this would take place alongside the contract negotiation and production so that all parties knew exactly what was involved before they signed the contract. But from a time perspective, this isn't always possible. And in these cases, the broader picture will form part of the contract negotiation, and the detail of it will need to be worked through later. But as well as setting KPIs when contracts are being drawn up, they also need a form of the basis of regular review and exercise so that all parties can compare performance against the required standards. So with a robust set of KPIs as laid out in the contract and the SLA, both the buyer and supplier can consider the current variances from agreed performance, any process inconsistencies which indicate underlying problems, and then further information that may be required in order to draw conclusions from the available data. So that's the end of Learning Outcome 2. Thank you for watching.